Welcome to the Northwest Boardroom. My name is Gower Talley, and I'm extremely excited to discuss with you today one of my very favorite topics, time management. Now, while it is one of my favorite topics, it's probably one of my least favorite terms. I mean, it just sounds silly on its face, doesn't it? Time management. As if there's anything we mere mortals could do to manage time. It just sounds presumptuous. I mean, in 5 minutes, it's going to be 5 minutes from now. For good or for ill, we will have all used the same 5 minutes, and there's absolutely nothing any of us could have done about that. No, when we talk about time management, we're usually really talking about self-management in time. We're talking about managing ourselves. In fact, when we seek to learn about time management, we're really asking one extremely basic question. What do I do? What do I do first? What do I do next? What's the best thing to do? What could I possibly do now? Well, folks, there is a clear, simple, and effective strategy used by some of the world's most remarkable people to decide what they should do, sometimes decision at a time, and I'd like to share that strategy with you today. This strategy revolves around taking things that you might do and subjecting them to a simple 2-question test. First, is it important? Now, importance speaks specifically to the potential value an action might have to you, your organization, and the people you serve. And second, is it urgent? Now, urgency speaks to time sensitivity. Does it matter tremendously when an action is completed? So after subjecting a potential action to our 2-question test, it is going to fall someplace on a simple 4 blocks matrix. Any potential action you might choose to take is either going to fall in quadrant 1 and be both important and urgent, quadrant 2 and be important but not urgent, quadrant 3 and be urgent but not important, or quadrant 4 and be neither urgent nor important. Now, quadrant 1, things that are both important and urgent, are putting out fires. Quadrant 1 is the home of crisis management. A good example of a quadrant 1 activity might be if you came upon a burning movie theater, putting the fire out and getting everybody out of the theater would definitely be a quadrant 1 activity because we can answer yes to both of our test questions. Is it important that we put the fire out? Well, yes, obviously. Now, does it matter when we put the fire out? Again, yes. If we decide to wait until tomorrow to put out the fire, then the actions we take to put out the fire would have far less value. Now, we're going to skip over quadrant 2, things that are important but not urgent. We'll come back to quadrant 2 in just a moment. Quadrant 3, things that are urgent but not important, is the home of false alarms. If your phone were to ring, but the person on the other end was a telemarketer or a wrong number, then answering the phone would be a quadrant 3 activity. A ringing phone has urgency. It demands our attention right now, but there would be no actual value or importance in answering the phone. Now, to return to our original analogy, evacuating a theater because of a prank or false alarm would be a quadrant 3 activity. There's urgency, all right. I mean, that alarm is demanding your attention right now, but because there's no real fire, there's no real importance. It really doesn't matter if anybody gets out of the theater or not. Now, quadrant 4, things that are neither important nor urgent, is going to get the least of our attention today. Quadrant 4 activities are pretty obvious. Quadrant 4 is the home of obvious time wasters. A quadrant 4 activity might be, reading a comic book next to the fire extinguisher. We can pretty easily recognize quadrant 4 activities. So, if Quadrant 1, important and urgent, is the home of putting out fires, is the home of crisis management, and Quadrant 3, urgent but not important, is the home of false alarms, and Quadrant 4, neither important nor urgent, is the home of time wasters, then what about Quadrant 2, important but not urgent? Well, folks, Quadrant 2, important but not urgent, is the home of proactivity. Now, if we look at our original analogy, where Quadrant 1, important and urgent, is getting people out of a burning theater, Quadrant 3, urgent but not important, is responding to a false alarm, and Quadrant 4, neither important nor urgent, is simply wasting time, then what would our Quadrant 2 activity be? Quadrant 2 activities, those things that are important but not urgent, these are proactive activities. In our analogy, they would be things like checking on the sprinkler system, working on evacuation plans, training employees on fire prevention, or perhaps verifying insurance coverage. Other real-world Quadrant 2 type activities might be things like training, self-development, planning activities, doing organizational development, and preparing for contingencies. Now, the problem is that many people in organizations do very little of real importance unless there is some level of external urgency applied. They seem to avoid Quadrant 2 like the plague. These reactive people in organizations act only when acted upon, and as such, they seem to find themselves living in Quadrant 1. I have to tell you, I have heard this 100 times. Man, you just do not know my boss, my workplace, my family. I spend all day, every day putting out fires. I mean, all this talk about being proactive is great, I guess, in theory. But man, I just don't have the time. Well, here is how life is for these terminally reactive people. They do spend all day putting out fires. They act only when acted upon. Now, when finally there is a break in the fires, they tend to gravitate all the way back here to Quadrant 4. I mean, after all they've been through, they deserve a break, don't they? Where the heck's my comic book? Wonder what Oprah's doing on her Facebook page. Then, out of nowhere, there's another crisis and they're back at it in Quadrant 1 again, putting out fires. Now, a lot of times, these people are so caught up in urgency that they can't tell the difference between Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 3. They spend as much time responding to irrelevant false alarms as they do responding to real crises. And folks, here's an even bigger problem. The more you live in Quadrant 1, the more Quadrant 1 problems there seem to be to deal with. Your ability to be proactive shrinks, and you tend to live in crisis management with occasional forays into false alarms and time wasters. Fortunately, there's another way. There is another way to look at yourself, your job, your organization, and the world. The most successful people I've ever encountered do everything they can to keep their attention, their focus, and their time in Quadrant 2 to the greatest degree possible. Now, when they get called into Quadrant 1, because everyone's going to have fires to put out, they deal with it. However, when they are done dealing with this particular crisis, they don't immediately seek to escape into the release of Quadrant 4 and waste time. These proactive people move directly back to Quadrant 2 and seek to create a way for that particular issue to never again become a crisis. Now here's even better news. When you focus on Quadrant 2, some interesting things begin to happen. There seem to be fewer Quadrant 1 fires to put out, and you seem to get better at identifying false alarms. The more you choose to be proactive, the more opportunities you will have to be proactive. Now, when you take the additional step of seeking to avoid time wasters, you can gain control of your activities, your schedule, and you will find that you get far more value from the time that you spend. So folks, I have a challenge for you for this next week. Think about what quadrant your activities fall in and do your very best to keep your plans, your activities, and your focus in quadrant 2. Now, when you find yourself in quadrant 1, and you're going to have to deal with things that have an element of externally imposed urgency, think about how to get that activity and that type of activity back under your control. Was there something you did or didn't do to allow this activity to be imposed upon you? How did this very important activity become a crisis? When you find yourself in quadrant 3, the home of activities with great urgency but absolutely no value, the home of false alarms, think about how to recognize these activities for what they are. Think about how to be less reactive to loudly ringing phones with no one on the other end. Now, when you find yourself in quadrant 4, recognize that you have chosen to waste time. There is neither importance nor urgency in quadrant 4. Now, while this is okay sometimes, ask yourself if this is where you default back to after a few stress-filled hours in quadrant 1. Is quadrant 4 where you come back and tend to rest and just sit and wait for some quadrant 1 crisis to drag you back into the world of crisis management? And finally, but perhaps most importantly, recognize that even though quadrant 2 is the home of the most productivity and the greatest value, no one is going to tell you to go do quadrant 2 work. The very nature of quadrant 2 is that going into quadrant 2 will always be your choice. Even if doing your job sometimes falls back into quadrant 1, getting better at your job will always fall into quadrant 2. Even if giving direction to your staff sometimes falls into quadrant 1, improving your relationship with your staff so that they are more likely to seek out your guidance falls in quadrant 2. Folks, quadrant 2 is the home of productivity. It is the home of doing the right thing when no one is looking. Almost all genuine greatness is achieved in quadrant 2. People who would choose greatness for themselves and their organizations find a way to spend most of their time right here. I really hope that you make the choice to focus in quadrant 2. Almost everyone who achieves any type of personal and professional greatness has made this choice. Thank you again for this moment of your time. My name is Gower Talley with the Northwest Boardroom. To find out more about the Northwest Boardroom, please visit www.thenorthwestboardroom.com.